Right. Afternoon, everybody. I'm back again, and we're talking about the second section of the Wasteland, second canto. We're talking about a game of chess. Now, we've been introduced in Burial of the Dead to what Eliot's concept of the wasteland actually is: this barren, desolate, unfertile um, emptiness, where there are no real clear instructions, and where people struggle um, to find any sense of meaning, any sense of hope, something that's essentially chaotic, built up of fragments of the past. And then we get into a game of chess, which is ultimately about a different type of infertility. There's lots of sex in the wasteland. It's not necessarily obvious sex, but there's definitely lots of it, which is one of the reasons that scholars think that this is actually could also be, well, apart from the existential threat of disaster in the post-war period, but actually about T.S. Eliot's miserable marriage that he was actually engaged in. Um, and this isn't again sits within this broader sense of the futility and the barrenness of the world in this post-war period of existential shock. Now, there are scholars who talk about modernism um, as being interested in chaos and interested in disaster that is separate to the social context of the post-war period. That is actually key to understanding modernism. But here you have Game of Chess. Now, what do we think about the title? Where does that actually stand in? Symbolically, chess, of course, is this whole symbol for strategy. It wasn't the original title for the second section. The original title is about people in a cage. So it's about people being controlled again, because this whole wasteland really is about lack of control, lack of certainty, lack of capacity to understand the world that we all live in. And here, but the most common use of symbolic use of the game of chess is, of course, about people being controlled, people being moved around. The essential nature of humanity is pawns in a greater game that we have actually no control over and can't actually see being played. And so here we have some more barrenness within this. Now, this is interestingly divided up into two sections, which ultimately talk about exactly the same thing, but they talk about it in different social contexts. The first opening section is firmly ensconced in the world of the aristocracy, the world of the privileged, the powerful. Ultimately, it's an empty and futile sense of powerfulness. And the second sect is really this whole dialogue played out again within a popular culture, in the culture of the working classes. So we're dealing with a repetition of theme and repetition of ideas here, played out in two sections. It's also a text that's about women. Men really don't come into this very much, except as vague existential discussions, this sort of foreign missing elements in some ways, which of course makes sense because this is about infertility and the way that relationships and sexuality are ultimately unfulfilled or unfulfilling as well. And so you have this separation between social classes actually designated dramatically by the shift in language of structure and style between the first part of Game of Chess and the second part of Game of Chess. So the first part, structurally and technically, this first part is mainly, though not completely regularly, set in blank verse, unrhymed iambic pentameter. A really traditional structure that's been a standpoint in English literature from all the way back from Milton in Paradise Lost and onwards. And so this is firmly, and the regularity and the traditional use of the structure in the opening section really fits very well if we actually have a look at what the setting of the opening is. Now, there's lots of, Eliot uses lots of allusion in his text, lots of literary allusion, lots of biblical allusion. The opening line of the whole poem from Burial of the Dead, April is the cruelest month, alludes to Chaucer's idea about April being the beginning of spring and the beginning of redemption, where, of course, it's an idea that Eliot twists and topples on its head in The Wasteland, because April is not about new beginnings, it's actually about hopelessness and lack of promise that these new beginnings actually create for us. In Game of Chess, it opens with another literary allusion. And this is a really interesting one in the context of what we actually see within this canto. It's an allusion to, and in fact, it's almost a direct quotation from the opening lines of Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra. And it's about the description of Cleopatra, who, of course, symbolizes sexual power, sexual beauty, promise, and almost a leap into disaster, because ultimately it's a great tragic love story. But this is a tragic love story that doesn't go anywhere. So we have a huge amount of really detailed and very beautiful imagery describing the closed world that this aristocratic woman lives in. There's a lot of beautiful references to description of things that reflect nature, but actually aren't natural at all. So it's sort of eerily alienated from connection to reality. She is sitting in a box. She is sitting in a beautiful box, but one that actually cuts her off from any sort of real connection with the world. Vaguely looking into the past, not actually seeing her, but not actually connected in any way to reality. So if we have a look at the opening, if we have a look at what it actually says, the chair she sat in, like a burnished throne, glowed on the marble with a glass held up by standards wrought with fruited vines, from which a golden Cupidon peeped out. Another hid his eyes behind his wing, doubled the flames of the 7-branched candelabra, reflecting light upon the table, as the glitter of her jewels rose to meet it from satin cases poured in rich profusion. In vials of ivory and coloured glass, unstoppered, lurked strange synthetic perfumes, unguent, powdered, liquid, troubled, confused, and drowned in the sense of odours, stirred by the air that freshened from the windows, that ease ascended in fattening the prolonged candle flames, flung their smokes into the laquaria, stirred the pattern on the coffered ceiling. Huge seawood fed with copper burned orange and green, framed by the coloured stone, in which sad light a carved dolphin swam. Above the antique mantel displayed a sylvan scene, as through a window gave upon a sylvan scene the change of Philomel by the barbarous king so rudely forced, and yet there the nightingale filled all the desert with inviolable voice, and still she cried, and still the world pursues. So there's an enormous richness in detail in the imagery here. It's a richness of the past in some ways. We have all these classical allusions to Cupidons and to the 7-branch candelabra that come out of Jewish tradition and that sit in the altars to light ritual meanings. But of course, there's no ritual here. Ultimately, she's sitting alone in her bedroom. We know it's her bedroom with the description of the jewels on her dressing table and the mirror and the perfumes and makeup. All that this woman, and she's essentially unnamed. We're not who she is. She has no name. She's just some sort of representative figure of broken aristocracy sitting in this closed kingdom. And then this section finishes, and she continues with the imagery of the nightingale. Now, the nightingale is a very interesting thing. The nightingale becomes this symbol for beauty and for love. We sing about it. People sing about it in songs like "A Nightingale Sang in Berkeley Square." We wait to listen. It's like this captured beauty that pours out liquid song at night and accompanies lovers' trysts. But of course, the original story of the nightingale, Philomel, who is raped by a barbarian king, and the gods turn her and her family into nightingales as some sort of compensation and recompense for that. And she's stuck within this internal world, singing beautifully, as her beauty is the thing that attracts the king, but ultimately it's a violation. And this sense of violation is really important in the wasteland. It's a violated world. Everything is violent and violated about it. And so here she sits. And you see then it moves to jug, jug, jug to dirty ears. What has traditionally been seen as this liquid, beautiful song of the nightingale, like everything else has become perverted. So the perfumes don't smell beautiful. Perfumes are strange, unguent, overpowering and synthetic. The room is supposed to be this beautiful setting, but it becomes like a coffin. When we're talking about the Laquaria, we're talking about the painted ceilings, and the coffered ceiling is actually something that's shaped like a chest. So it closes over the woman as she sits here waiting for something, brushing out her hair. Um, and the images from the past, the images of the cupids and the nightingales, they stop being symbols of love and joy. They become symbols of violation, symbols of something that you can't have. And so it goes on in this section, withered stumps of time. Those echoes of the past are no longer things that support, engage, inspire, but they're things that cripple. They're things that have been transformed from things of beauty into things of desolation, things that of unification to things of alienation. Now, there's lots of interesting scholarship about the relationship that's going on with the woman and the man that's not there. We hear his footsteps on the stairs in the next section. Some people think that she's waiting for a lover. Some people think she's waiting for a lover. Some scholars think that it's a husband and wife who just can't communicate anymore. They're supposed to be in this fruitful relationship, but it doesn't happen. My reading of this is a little bit different. I'm not actually sure that the lover is still alive. I think she's caught waiting for somebody who's not coming. The footsteps are echoes, like everything else in the room, are echoes of the past. She hears waiting for something that can never be fulfilled, never achieved. And I think I see that reading as something that I see reflected in the second half, because in the second half of the game of chess, you have Lil waiting for her husband Albert to return from the war. This woman could be representative of the millions of women who sit in their rooms and wait for husbands and lovers that never return. And the cost to all of that, the cost of this alienation to both Lil and to the woman, are incredibly devastating. Here she is driven almost into despair and madness. And there are scholars who see the woman actually reflecting Dido, Queen of Carthage, another Phoenician reference. Remember how we talked about Carthage being that great Phoenician city whose culture was completely overwhelmed and destroyed by the Romans. And in the Romans, you have the settlement and the creation of European civilization. Dido, who, deserted by her lover, gives into despair and throws herself onto the fire, cursing Rome to eternal enmity and civilization to violence, war, and destruction. All of thematically, which fits really nicely within the alienated nature of what the wasteland actually is. There's no sense that there's ever any connection in any of the conversation, regardless of whether the footsteps on the stairs are lover, husband, or ghost. There's no communication between them. Whatever has been between the woman and the footsteps has led to nothing. She is trapped, despairing and unhappy. And the voices on the stairs, the footsteps on the stairs, talk about things that are really harsh. So she makes appeals. She's brushing out her hair, so she's like this Medusa figure. The hair is fiery. The hair is dramatic sexuality made flesh in this woman's hair. And she brushes it out, and she talks about it as fiery, under the firelight, under the brush, her hair spread out in fiery points. So you have her trapped in the past. You have her trapped in this alienated world. And then she speaks. We actually have lots of dialogue in this section. In the second half of a game of chess, it's almost all dialogue. We get the same ideas, the same sense of infertility, the same sense of lost potentiality, the same sense of wasted sexuality in the second section, half of Game of Chess, as we do in the first half, but in that section it's almost all dialogue. So what does she actually say? My nerves are bad this night. Yes, stay with me. Speak to me. Why do you never speak? Speak! What are you thinking? What? Thinking what? I never know what you're thinking. Think. Is this an appeal to someone who's ultimately rejected her? Is it an appeal to somebody that she can't see anymore? And then we shift speaker. I think we're in Rat's Alley, where dead men lost their bones. And so again, we return to death and despair. what is the Rat's Alley? You could see that as an explicit allusion to the trenches, full of rats feasting on the bodies of the dead and the living, the injured and the wounded. The only fat and flourishing things in the trenches of the Western Front were the rats. And then she speaks again. And I'm pretty certain that we shifted back to the woman speaking here, though, like a lot of the dialogue in T.S. Eliot's Wasteland, we're never actually really clear about whose narrative voice it is at any particular time, unless it says very specifically, like in the next canto that we're going to look at, when it's about Tiresias, when we clear who is speaking is Tiresias, watching the events from a distant past. But for the rest, speakers and time are all blurred together, past, present, and future. None of it is clear. And so, who's speaking? That wind, what is that noise? That wind under the door. What is that noise now? What is the wind doing? Nothing again. Nothing. Do. You know nothing. Do you see nothing? Do you remember nothing? How nihilistic is this section? And this is the section that makes me think that who she's speaking to is actually to a ghost. I can't. The memories of the past, the voices of the lovers have become like words under the door, insubstantial, fleeting, something you can't even become hold of. Whatever there was between them, living and dead, it has now come to utter despair. Nothing. And you have this fragmentation of this line, this repetition of the theme in this section, that all of this relationship is led to ultimately into nothingness. And then I remember, those are pearls that were his eyes. Alive? Are you alive or not? Is there nothing in your head? And a reference back to the tarot cards that are from the Burial of the Dead, with the drowned Phoenician sailor whose eyes are replaced by pearls. Dead and blind, communicating nothing, seeing nothing, meaning nothing. An ultimate rejection of the past, an ultimate rejection of a relationship, an ultimate rejection of the fact that there is connection that leads to anything. This is the ultimate sense of despair, the ultimate sense of alienation, the alienation that underpins everything in the wasteland, the sense of chaos that we can know and understand nothing about the text. And so we come to, then we shift, and there's this use of but. Now, but is a conjunction, and it stands alone in the line, and really unusually placed in the line. It doesn't start at the beginning and then you fall into something else. You have a but that stands as a conjunction that links the two sections of a game of chess. The upper class woman living in despair, despairingly alone amongst her memories, and beautiful richness that actually doesn't fulfill or provide any sense of happiness or satisfaction, or conclusion or fruitfulness. And then we move into popular culture. We move away from elusive references to Shakespeare in the opening line to, that Shakespearean rag, popular music from the time. So we have a reiteration of this Shakespearean allusion, but something that's completely transformed from something profound, perhaps, to something banal. And the banality of contemporary life is also something that is important to T.S. Eliot in the way that he actually discusses the wasteland. T.S. Eliot is somebody who is grounded in the richness of European culture. His work is full of allusions. You can look it up, how many literary allusions are in the wasteland, and you're going to get pages of them. People spend their lives looking for the allusions, and the allusions are there because Eliot wants them to be there. He's a scholar. He sees connections from culture as actually representative of civilization. So this transformation of rich high culture to low popular culture is actually part of that destruction that he's talking about, the destruction of things that are actually meaningful, that make the wasteland exist. That is what the wasteland is, the destruction of things that matter. And leaving behind residues that are actually ultimately futile, ultimately empty, and definitely infertile. and unfulfilled. So you go from ancient culture to popular culture. You go from sadness and despair, loss and longing, and almost an incipient madness into this really banal dialogue that we're about to get engaged in. So, ooh, 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 it's the Shakespearean rag. It's so elegant, so intelligent. And is it any of those things? Is it either elegant or intelligent? Um, Now, ragtime is a really, it's contemporary with modernism. It arrives in the early 20th century. It's the beginnings of jazz. It's a definite throwing out of the rules of and ideas of what music actually should be like, and lyricism is something completely new, and something that's actually quite looked down on as the music of the working classes. It's popular, but not particularly um, seen as significant. It's the Justin Bieber of the world, of the musical world in the early 20th century. Um, and so we have another speaker. Is this the same speaker? Is this what shall I do now? What shall I do? I shall rush out as I am, walk down the street with my hair down. What shall we do with tomorrow? What shall we ever do? Interesting question. Who's the speaker? Is it the woman? Is it she trying to flee her room, trying to flee her past? Is it somebody else who's completely different? It's hard. It's actually hard to say. But again, these are dialogue of despair. Somebody who's looking for meaning and can't find it. And it's interspersed between these fragments of of life, which are supposed to actually provide meaning, but actually haven't really provided anything very much at all. The hot water at 10, and if it rains, a closed car at 4, and we shall play a game of chess. We shall pretend that we can control the world. Pressing lidless eyes. What eyes have no lids? The eyes of the grinning skulls of the dead, waiting for a knock upon the door. So most people still think that this is actually a transition from the aristocratic. This is still the aristocratic woman speaking, still trying to seek meaning. She's left her room and trying to exit into the world, but the world's not helping her either. It's not providing her with anything more than she had while she was waiting patiently in her room for the footsteps on her door, or the footsteps in the hall to open a door that are never going to come. And then we have the definite break. Now, there are some scholars who think that the Lil is actually short for Lilith, the sort of transient sexual person, Adam's second wife, genie, sexual temptress, the replacement for Eve. And if it is, she's not been a particularly successful one. And so the dialogue now shifts out of the beautiful aristocratic world into your local pub. Nothing more normal, nothing more ordinary, nothing more banal than that. And you have basically, we're overhearing a section of gossip, and not actually particularly nice gossip. And we're talking about Lil waiting for her husband. Well, we're talking about Lil who's not present. We know that the use of the third person in this section actually makes it quite clear that somebody else is talking about her situation. Is it a mother? Is it a neighbor? Is it a friend? Is it somebody's auntie? And we don't know. We don't really know the sex, though it's almost certainly by the context seems to be female. This lovely idea of the destructive nature of female relationships, which nag and at each other and come to represent patriarchal values. And Lil's not having a particularly nice time. Lil's husband's been away at the war for 4 years. She's spent the money that was sent to her to provide her with new teeth. And there's an odd tradition amongst the working classes in the 19th century that actually a lot of women for their wedding present were given money to replace all their teeth with dentures, because when they got married, when they had children, what was going to happen was that the teeth were going to fall out, which is pretty standard treatment when there wasn't any dentistry. And in fact, there's an old wives' tale that each pregnancy equals the loss of a tooth, which is probably grounded in the reality for all the poor in this period. But Lil hasn't had her teeth taken out. She spends the money that Albert sends her to replace her teeth so that she can be beautiful for him when she comes home, and on money having an abortion that nearly kills her, an abortion that leaves her looking ancient and raddled at the age of 31, mother of already of 5 children and doesn't want any more. The ultimate way to talk about lack of control. So she's had an abortion, which is it's absolutely symbolic for barrenness. It's the ultimate symbol of interrupted fertility. And if fertility equals the future, then an abortion equals the negation of the future, the rejection of the future. And she's waiting for Albert to come home. And Albert's not coming home because he loves her. Albert's not coming home to Lil because she's his wife and the mother of his 5 children, and he's been longing to create some sense of relationship with her again. Albert's coming home so he can have sex, because after 4 years he's a bit desperate. And the woman says quite clearly, well, if you're not beautiful enough, there's plenty of other women who can offer him up what you're not going to be able to get. So you should have spent the money on your teeth and making yourself beautiful. What a terrible vision of marriage is that? There's no companionship there. There's no relationship there. There's this ultimately transactional relationship. The man puts his penis in the woman, has his jollies off, and that's the entire basis for marriage. A bleaker vision of the institution has never been written than in this section of the Wasteland. And of course, this is marriage that actually led to something that's completely unfruitful. Now, it doesn't actually use the word abortion. He talks about, I can't help. If Albert so if we hurry up halfway down and said, I can't help it, she said, pulling a long face. Them pills I took to bring it off, she said. She's had 5 already and nearly died of young George. So the it, of course, is the baby. Bringing it off is the ending of the pregnancy. And women can't control their fertility at this point in time. They actually have no sense of control. Condoms actually exist, but they're expensive and they're for the rich and the louche. No respectable middle class, working class married woman would be involved in using condoms, and they couldn't afford to buy them anyway. So she's had 5 children. She's nearly died because of that lack of control over her fertility. And the only thing that she can do to control it is take some pills, and they nearly kill her. The ultimate symbol of lack of control, I think, over your own fate and your own fortune. And there's this sort of the next lines. Well, what you get married for if you don't want children? There's this sense of futility in that is the way that it is. If you can't get Albert to leave you alone when you know you're going to be fertile, well, then that's the case. Women here are the ultimate symbols of powerlessness, and we're going to see that in continuing in the text. And ultimately, because they have no power, they ultimately can't control anything about their world, not even if they have children. But of course, unless they're willing to have children, then again, they're ultimately worthless. We don't know whether the woman in the first section of the Game of Chess has kids, but it doesn't seem like it. That we don't have any mention of children like we do in the second. She's barren because of whatever reason separates her and her husband, and that makes her worthless. In the same way, and that Lil has become worthless because she's no longer this beautiful woman that with perfect teeth that Albert's going to want to shag when he gets back from 4 years after 4 years of war. And this is punctured. This section here is punctured with this repetition, this repeating line, hurry up, it's time, written in capital letters. Notice the capitalization. It's like the trump of doom. And in some ways you can see this is that it's literally probably the barkman telling you that it's time. But it also represents, I think, death and ultimate lack of call. Hurry up, it's time. You have no control over everything in your life, and death is coming to us all. This is the voice of doom speaking out. Hurry up, it's time. Live your life. Hurry up, it's time. And then it finishes then afterwards. Hurry up, please, it's time. Hurry up, please, it's time. It's a repetition, one line after the other. And then there's this sense of good nights. Good night, Bill. Good night, Lou. Good night, mate. Good night. Ta-ta. Good night. Good night. The ending. Night time is ending in every symbolic sense in the text. And in good night, sweet ladies, good night. So we go back to another reference from a popular song at that time, but a reference that ultimately leads to death and despair. Good night. We are going into the good night. Think of Dylan Thomas's poem, Rage, Rage, Rage Against the Going of the Light. Do not go swiftly into that good night. Nighttime is death. So you have what on the surface is this conversation between people in a pub, which is actually symbolically this conversation about lack of control, lack of power, powerlessness, and human life with no meaning, no control, and that leads from life into death. Fruitless, barren, empty life of no real connection, no real communication. This is despair, and it is despair explored through the lives of women. Explored through the lives of women because regardless of their social status, they are the most powerless creatures within the society of the time, of contemporary society. Controlled, valued for really not a great deal, apart from their looks, which are transient and fleeting, and even that, because there's no indication that the woman in the first half of Game of Chess isn't beautiful, with her glowing hair and her perfumes and her makeup and her rich life. But that's worthless and means nothing anyway. And that's how this section finishes, with good night. Good night, goodbye, good night, sweet ladies, good night.